This is an interview of Frank Sullivan on July 21st, 2016, located at 1705 North Indian River Drive, Cocoa, Florida. Interviewers are Griffin Bixler and Michael Boonstra. Cameraman is Jeff Thompson, copyright Brevard County Historical Commission, 2016. Alright, Frank. Could you tell me when and where you were born, and where did you live growing up?
Well, that is a story. I was not born in Cocoa, even though everybody thinks I've been here. I was here before I was born, though. That we didn't have any hospitals. And this is in 1937. And the mothers that wanted a hospital were getting on a train and going to Jacksonville to deliver babies. I think they were just starting one or two and going to Orlando. But my mother said she'd been down here in the boonies kind of long enough. She went back to her mother, my grandmother's, on Long Island. So I was here before I was born. I was gone for a couple of weeks, and then I came back. So I was not born here. I'll never forgive her for that either. And anyway, what's the rest of the question? I've been here really since 37. My folks came down in 1935, and they have been here ever since. Actually, my mother's father had business here in Brevard County starting in the 20s. And so sometime my grandfather had passed away early in 31, 32. And so my uncle came down to run the businesses. And then when Mom and Dad got married, they came down to help.
And give us their names.
Yeah, that was, my uncle was Jack Dalbora. They came down. He came down probably in the early 30s after my grandfather passed away. And what my grandfather did, he was a receiver, what they used to call, in New York. He was an Italian. He immigrated over here. In fact, we have his immigration papers still, which is interesting. And he started in the produce business, because that's what he knew, in New York, and ended up, in those days, the growers, both in Florida and in California, would send their product to a metropolitan market. And they would have an auction every morning with whatever produce was there. And this was the days before you had a lot of chain grocery stores. They had a lot of independent grocery stores. And those buyers would come in, and really, it was interesting to watch, because if they had something they really wanted, they would jump up and down and scream and holler. You think they're going to kill each other trying to get get what they wanted. But that's what started my grandfather, the association in Florida, because he would make deals with the growers and the packers in Florida to represent them at the market in New York. And we always sent to Philadelphia, Boston, and New York were the big markets for Florida. It was on the East Coast, and that's where the population was. So that's how they got to Florida. And then actually it got to be a bigger deal in Florida, because eventually you started getting chain stores, and you'd have a buyer with an 800 number calling suppliers in Florida. They didn't need the auction markets anymore. They would buy direct.
Tell us about this house, 1705 North Indian River Drive. When was it built, and how much did it cost? Who were the architect and builder?
Well, it was built in 1939. We used to live right behind it in a rental house. That's where Mom and Dad lived until when they first came down in 35. And my uncle lived next door. Dad actually went to Orlando for an architect. Stevens and Sipple was the architect. And Mr. Rommel, who, Michael, you know well, really didn't think that was necessary. He didn't know why he had to go to the big city to get an architect. But Herbie Bauer, who was a local contractor, did build the house. And believe it or not, this house it cost $9,200 to build in 1939. And I often wondered, that was kind of a different amount. when you look at the deed restrictions, this is a Broadview Manor was a subdivision that first Florida boom back in the 20s was platted. And you look at the deed restrictions, and you couldn't have any chickens or pigs. You had to have indoor plumbing, and there are several other things. You couldn't build on the riverside anything that was higher than the crown of the road. And the house had to cost over $9,000. So that's how they got to 9,200.
Okay, so since you grew up here and since you lived on the Indian River, what kind of activities did that lead to?
Playing in the river most of the time. You know, that was our recreation. We didn't have television. We didn't have Little League. We didn't have things like that. So you did a lot of in the river stuff. I mean, we did fishing. You did getting oysters. Always had a boat. Most times a rowboat. We didn't have. It was a long time before we got a boat with a motor on it. But we spent a lot of time outside. A lot of time on your bicycle. And you wanted to go someplace, you'd either walk or take your bicycle. If you wanted to go to town, you'd start walking. If somebody came by, they'd pick you up because everybody knew everybody else. And if they didn't, you'd just walk all the way, or you'd ride your bicycle and you could get there too. The big thing to do on Saturday afternoon was go to the State Theater, which is the Playhouse now. And until you were, I think it was 12 or 13, you got in for 9 cents to the Saturday afternoon double feature. You got 2 double features, a cartoon, a cereal. A cereal is, you know, it's like the things on television now. You see to a point where the girl was tied down to the railroad track and the train's coming. You'd have to come back next Saturday to see who saved her. That was the cereal. And the news. You always got the world news. So that was big entertainment on Saturday afternoon.
You talked a little bit about your mother's side of the family, the Dalboras. Could you give us some information, some interesting details about your father's side, the Sullivans?
Yeah, of course they came into this country. Actually, my grandfather was a second generation. But he came into Boston when he immigrated from Ireland, and married and moved. After he married, moved to Brooklyn. Moved down to Brooklyn, and my grandfather actually ran the cafeteria for one of the New York newspapers, and I can't tell you which one. For the employee cafeteria is what he did, and his first wife died in the flu epidemic in the teens, 1915, 16, somewhere in there, 17, yeah.
That was right after World War I.
Yeah, and so my father was one of 3 boys, and so Grandpa Sullivan remarried shortly after, not shortly, but I mean after that, because his youngest brother was just born when my first grandmother died, and he remarried, and so the only grandmother we knew was Grandma Sullivan, and she was 3 days short of 100 when she passed away, and everybody was gathered here to have her birthday party, and she died, so we had a funeral instead. So it was a happy, sad occasion, but she was 100 years old when she was 3 days short of 100 when she passed away, and she eventually moved to Florida. Of course, she went through, and both my parents and everybody else went through the Depression, and Grandma never did trust a bank after she lost what little bit of money she had, and I think she had called it a dime bank, what they used to have, and they closed, and she lost her money, so she never trusted a bank again, and of course she was younger than my grandfather, and when he passed away, they had moved to Long Island, and she took in boarders and did laundry and did what she had to do to survive, and she worked hard, and eventually moved to Florida. and her sister, she had a sister who had moved to Ormond Beach. And so Grandma moved to Ormond Beach too, and they had houses that the backyards met, little house. And to show how tough she was about 92 before she moved back down here to Cocoa. And she had to get a new roof on her little house. So she sent me she'd gotten 3 bids to get a roof on it. And she asked me which one I liked, but true to form, she said, this is the one I like. But not true to form, it wasn't the cheapest one. It was one in the middle. I said, well, Grandma, why'd you pick this one? She said, they're the only ones that give me a 20-year warranty. She was 92 years old, worried about a 20-year roof. So she was a character.
So how did the Sullivans get involved with the citrus then and the Dalboras?
Well, when Dad married my mother, of course, his
They
other...
met here?
No, they met in New York. They met on Long Island because they both lived in the same community there. And actually, they met. Dad liked to sing, and I think he was in some little performance of some sort, either community or at the church or whatever. And that's where they met, and eventually got married. Dad worked during the Depression. He worked on Wall Street, actually. He said he was glad to have a job, even though he only got paid. He'd work 2 weeks to get paid for 1 week, but at least he had a job that he was getting paid for, working on Wall Street. And he wasn't high up in any financial institution, but he was working on the floor, and had some good friends, made some good friends while he was there that he kept over his lifetime. But then when they got married in '35, my uncle needed some help down here, so that's what got them to Florida. Now, my uncle, of course, came down. His father my grandfather had already gotten into the citrus business down here because that was part of his business for up there too. And he ended up with three packing houses that he was interested in. And during the Depression, of course, money was tight there too. So that's when they came down. They closed 2 of the packing houses and kept the one here in Cocoa. And that's what got them to Cocoa.
I understand your family is Catholic. Can you tell us about the Catholic community in the area where you attended church and how and why they were considered a minority?
Yes. In fact, my uncle, when they first came down here, there were 2 of the packing houses. One was in Cocoa, one was in Titusville. And actually, I think it was in Mims. And so he was living his first house was in Indian River City, which is not even there anymore. That's the south end of Titusville. And Catholic, they didn't know really what to do with the Catholic down here. And in fact, one night the Klan even made a visit to him. Yeah, tell him they didn't like Catholics. But anyway, eventually he moved back to Cocoa, and it was a lot quieter here than it was up there. So the Catholic church, the little church I grew up in is there on Barton Boulevard. The city of Rockledge owns it now, and I think they use it for weddings and things like that. And of course, St. Mary's is across the street now. It was always a small congregation. I have a picture somewhere from I think it was 1932, where they had the whole congregation on the steps taking a picture. And my mother's there as kind of young. You can see her there. So it has grown a lot since then. Needless to say, it's got a school. Our girls all went to St. Mary's, and now we have one teaching there. So, the Catholic community has grown like everything else around here. When I was growing up, and you were talking about what we did, there were only 20,000 people in the whole county. And we have 550,000 now, and they wonder what happened to the river. The lagoon is known as. In fact, somebody was talking to me the other day, a couple of weeks ago, about the lagoon and how terrible it was, and all the septic tanks we have now, and agriculture with fertilizer, and I said, I'll tell you what's wrong with the lagoon. And he said, well, what? I said, when did you come here? He said, 1986. I said, well, there's number one. So we can go from there. We had a clean river, and we didn't have any problems. We had septic tanks, we had agriculture, and we still had a clean river. We didn't have any manatees either. If you saw a manatee, it was a big to do. I mean, you drew a crowd. And we never had manatees here because we were too far north. And now every time they put the power plants in, that's when we got manatees. And another, I don't know whether I should preach or not, but Florida Power and Light tore down that fuel-powered plant to get natural gas plant. And they had to spend millions of dollars. First, the only way they could get the permit was if they put heaters in the water so that when it got to a certain degree of temperature, the manatees would have to go place to go, and they'd have to heat the water. And it's just ridiculous, but don't get me started on manatees. I do hear they taste like chicken.
So maybe if you could just talk a little bit about the war years and that.
Okay. Well, of course, the war years were, we, especially along the river here, the backside of the street lights were all painted black so that there weren't, you didn't put a glow out. Our headlights were half painted black for blackout. And Dad was not able to go to war because he had some medical problems. But he was part of the citizens patrol on the beach. They would patrol the beach at night. And there were some interesting things. So I can remember as a kid finding shells, cartridges from machine guns on the beach that would wash up. I can remember one ship was sunk by a German U-boat that you could see it from the shore. I mean, bow was sticking up out of the water. So we did have some activity here, and they had watchtowers along the beach, and the citizens would patrol it at night. And so we had rationing. You could only get so many shoes. I was always being fussed at because I wore out shoes too much. But everything was rationed. And you worked hard to conserve. And I'm not sure this country would ever be ready to get on a war footing again, because I don't think the people are strong enough to do what we went through in World War II. So.
You were a kid then?
I was a kid, yeah.
So from your perspective, was it all, you had a good time, I'm thinking?
Well, I didn't have a good time. I mean, had the same time you always had. The thing is, you did have to think about, you didn't have as much because it was rationed. I mean, gasoline, I remember my folks had a Buick. When the war started, they got rid of it right away. Had a Chevrolet because it was just too much. You couldn't get gas. And, things like shoes and meat and things like that were rationed. A lot of vegetables were grown. Had Victory Gardens. And, of course, it was easy for us because of the groves. We did have some land that we could plant some things on. So that was good. But
is that where the Victory name came from, though, from the war years? For the
No. Actually, the Victory Groves was started back in the late 1800s by a Whaley family. Marion Whaley came down here from, I think they were from Macon, around the Macon, Georgia. And it was kind of after the Civil War. A lot of them had lost a lot of, what they ever had in Georgia. And they came down here and really homesteaded on Merritt Island. In fact, I have a letter from Mr. Whaley to Mr. Turnbull, and you probably know the Turnbull hammock up there at Mims. And Mr. Turnbull was going to, the contract, it was a handwritten contract, he was going to clear, this is dated 1906, he was going to clear 5 acres of land for Mr. Whaley up on the island. And after he got finished clearing it, he would either trade him his launch that he used to take the fruit out to the river, in the middle of the riverboat would come in and take the fruit and take it north to Jacksonville, and then they'd put it on steamers to take to metropolitan markets. But he'd trade him his launch, and he named it. I don't remember the name, but he named his launch. Or if he didn't want the launch, he'd pay him $75. In 1906, I know that 5 acres, you wouldn't have walked across it for $75. Mosquitoes would carry you. The mosquitoes were horrible. That was another thing. People don't realize, you worry about mosquitoes now. We used to have mosquitoes, even when I was growing up. You could put your hand on a screen and take it away, and you'd have an outline of your hand from the mosquitoes. Everything, you see screen porches here, and we used to have one in the back door. We don't, and that's been incorporated into the house now, but you'd never open a door right into the house. You'd always come into the screen door you'd wipe off, you'd have, they call them mosquito beaters now, the old timers that get together once a year, and you'd have it's like a palm frond that would be wrapped up, and you brush the mosquitoes off the screen before you open the door, and then you'd come into the screen porch and get whatever came in before you came into the house. And so mosquitoes were terrible. I can remember you'd have somebody on a tractor up on North Merritt Island. It'd be 90 degrees, 95 degrees out. You'd have long sleeves, long pants, and sometimes they'd even put in the gear shift box of the tractor, they'd put a little smudge pot there, a little something to make smoke, just to be able to stay on the tractor. They were terrible. It wasn't until World War II when what's Patrick Air Force Base now was Banana River Naval Air Station, that when the military got here that we started getting some spray. And even I can remember as a kid, we used to have a push lawnmower, but we finally got a power mower. It wasn't self-propelled, you still had to push it. And there was a guy in town that he was really in the outboard motor business, but he figured out how you could put a tank mounted on the handlebars and drop it into the manifold of the power mower, and you spray out mosquito stuff. You get the DDT from the county, they give it to you, and you could spray around your house. And I made a little bit of money spraying some of the other houses in the neighborhood, even when I was a kid. They were that bad.
You had talked about how sparsely populated Brevard County was
Right.
back in the day. What did the locals think when the space boom hit the area? Your wife came during that time, right?
Yes, well, she came down in 1964, and it was boomtown in those days. Actually, it started back in the late 50s, maybe in 55, 56, because we were kind of watching it closer than anybody, because when they took over the North Merritt Island property, when NASA took over, and that was the second thing. The first they took over they called it the Eastern Missile Test Range or something like that, and down at Patrick, and that's when they reactivated that post, and they were firing just, they called it, it was like a V2 rocket, is all it was a rocket, and it triggers something else. Because there was nothing here but oranges just about, and cattle out west, every year we had what was called the Orange Jubilee, and it was a big celebration for the town. We had a big parade, as big as you can think when you don't have many people here, but it was something that all the citrus growers were involved in, and they'd have contests for fruit and other things that would go along with the festivities. And I'll never forget, it started as we got more people in town and fewer orange people or citrus people, that didn't really have the impact that it did early on. But I can remember that one of the last ones that they had, and to have something different, the people at Patrick came in at Provo Park now. It was a ball stadium in those days, and they had a V2 rocket mounted on a trailer, a big semi-trailer, and they set it off. They lit the engine, and that was the biggest thing and the loudest thing we'd ever seen. And we watch people go to the moon now, but that was really the beginning of it. And then when they did buy up all that land in North Merritt Island, that was kind of hard things to see, because we didn't realize the impact it was going to have on the industry. There was 9,000 acres of the best citrus land in the country up there, and when they bought out all the original owners, they let them lease it back for I think it was 3 years or 5 years. And then what they did was they combined up to about 250 acre blocks and then lease them out to anybody. So, toward the end of what was going on up there, we had about 850 acres leased, but the Department of Interior took over the grounds, and they told us that they only wanted native plants on government property, and citrus only came over in the 1400s. So they told us, we're going to get rid of the citrus. We don't want this non-native plant up there. And it took about 50 years, but there's not a tree up there. And I hope they're happy, because there are a lot of dead trees up there. And the birds have been sitting in them, dropping the Brazilian pepper seeds. So they got Brazilian peppers everywhere. And that's a long way from a native plant. It serves them right. Because it was kind of sad. I mean, there was good employment. It was good for the environment. There was a lot of labor. There were hundreds of people working up there, and it didn't matter. They were going to get rid of it.
Did the families feel like they were treated fairly, or was there some bitterness?
There was some bitterness, especially when some of the smaller growers got put into a bigger 250 acre block, and they just couldn't compete really and they were bitter. Yeah, there was some bitterness. In fact, I know one of them sued my father when he ended up with one of their pieces that had their acreage in it, and they said just because we had a packing house we could afford to do it, and we were going to gyp them, and all those good things. We had to go to Atlanta and defend ourselves, but it wasn't proven that we'd do anything different than anybody else would. So, but there was some bitterness, yeah.
And that was that whole area where the famous Dummett, the groves, the original groves.
The original Dummett Grove. Well, it went all the way up to. Actually, it went all the way up to the old Ede Estate, which is where State Road 3 comes out to US 1 at Oak Hill. It went all the way up that far. A lot of it north of Hull Canal. Now, when the freezes of the 80s came along, a lot of that was frozen out up there. And that's when the government really decided, we're not going to let you replant. And they put pine trees in. So that was really the beginning of the end when those freezes of the 80s hit. They were able to start grabbing an acreage back then because it was frozen out. We had 17 degrees a couple of times on Merritt Island in those days. You can't grow anything at 17 degrees.
Is that the biggest freezes that you remember?
Biggest one I remember was 89, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Florida always had freezes. Actually, in 1895, there was the big freeze in Florida. And in those days, most of the citrus was along the transportation routes, which is the St. Johns and the Indian River, along this coast and up to St. Johns, all the way to Jacksonville. A lot of it is far north. A lot of it was in Ocala. And in 95, that freeze really did almost wipe out the industry. And the story goes that the Dummett Grove survived because in those days you had the water protected, the warm water protected Merritt Island. And so they got budwood out of the Dummett Grove to really bring the industry back. It was, it was probably 10, 12 years before Florida got back to where they were in 95. So, but we always had freezes, but Merritt Island was, as the other plus for Merritt Island, it was warmer than the rest of you'd get a freeze, it'd kind of go down, we call it the Florida Ridge, Orange County all the way down through Polk County. And we were pretty protected over here. So a lot of times we made a little money during a freeze until you get to 17 degrees and then everybody got frozen. So.
What were some of your earliest careers?
My careers? Well, I guess starting about 15 and working in a packing house. Maybe a little earlier than that. Yeah, that was our career. I mean, everybody worked.
Did you work with the one here in Cocoa?
Yeah, the one in Cocoa. And Dad, my father uh, actually worked with Dalbor Company until 1952, and they decided to get out of the packing business and just be growers. And so that's when they closed their packing house, and that's when Dad bought the packing house that was actually down past the Baptist, where the Baptist church is, and the turnaround on the south end of Brevard Avenue. There's an engineering firm on that property now. It went from there was a lumber company right on the corner where Baptist Church parks now, and then our packing house was next. Went all the way down to Sweet Street. It was a big wooden building, and the railroad. That there were 4 packing houses along that rail line that came in behind where the Cocoa Water Tower is now, and the school, the Cocoa High School and elementary school was all on. There was 2 buildings, but all on the same campus, and it came in just south of there. Nevins which is the parish family, had a packing house there, and then it went down into Dalbor's packing house, which is. It's just to the, it's where Forest Avenue kind of comes into 520. There's that little right in the corner. There's a Mexican or an Indian gift shop. I think he's just closing. That was a Greyhound bus station and a Texaco gas station. And then the Dalbor packing house was east of that, where there's a vacant land. And then you went down the freight house, where all the freight came in and out of, was right there in the Cocoa parking lot, which is about where Crest Cleaners is now, a little bit north of there, that piece of property, which is parking lot. And then it went, the rail line went down through where the Cocoa City Hall is now, and that road that goes just east of where the post office is, that was rail line that went all the way down to, there was a packing house where the telephone company is now. There was a packing house. The Porches had a packing house out over the river, because they used to bring, before there was a bridge to Merritt Island, they used to bring their fruit over on a boat to their packing house, right to the back it right up to the packing house. And then you go south down to our packing house. And there was a cold storage plant on the other side where the Mexican restaurant is now. And in 59, well, just before 59, the city of Cocoa, the Dalbor had closed their packing house. Nevins had moved their packing house to Titusville. The other one, Poche, was out, and the other packing house had moved to Mims and consolidated. And so we were the only one left that the Far East Coast had to service, and they had to service us. But the area was growing, and the railroad came right down Forest Avenue, and all cars would have to stop, everybody. And there wasn't a US 1. I mean, that was US 1. So everybody had to stop for the train coming through, and it was slow. And changing cars around, you know how that goes. So the city made a deal with my father. And if he would move, they would pay him $120,000 to move so that they could get the rail out. And that was more money than we'd ever seen in one place in our lives. But in the summer of '59, we had one more season to run the packing house while we were making plans to move. And so in the summer of '59, though, we started having a firebug in town. And the old city hall, which they'd already moved the city hall, but it used to be right across from Travis Hardware, that parking lot. That was the old city hall. They tried to burn that. On Poinsett, it was a church. It's now a women's club. They tried to burn that, and of course those were all blocked, and they didn't burn very well. They burned down the cold storage plant, and a month or so later, they burned down our packing house, and it was, old Merritt Island mahogany. The thing burned. It was 4th of July, 4th of July of '49. We had the biggest fireworks they'd had in a long time. And then the city backed out of the contract with Dad, said that, we're not going to give you a permit to rebuild. So that was the end of that. We did sue and get some money, but nothing like we like we had originally supposedly gotten. So that's when Dad, right away, he needed something for that season. So we packed down in Fort Pierce at a friend's packing house. We did that season. But that was the same time that the Whaley family, who all their groves were up inside the Cape, and they decided that they really didn't want to, they didn't want to be in the packing business anymore. So that's when we got Victory Groves. So it was about 61 that we started packing at Victory Groves, and that was their name, Victory Groves. And we still get letters, Victory Gardens. But they, even back at the turn of the century, they were Victory Groves. It was probably he probably put it on because he was a victory just to survive on Merritt Island, North Merritt Island. But that was their name. So, and that was the thing that as I call it, the E Day Estate, which was a very
How do
old.
you spell that, Frank?
E was the first initial, D-A-Y was the last name. And I never knew Mr. Day, but everybody called it the E Day Estate because it was in the family as their, what they got from whoever Mr. Day was, the original Mr. Day was. But they had trees up there that they kept ladders up there because everything was picked by hand, going up a ladder. They needed such long ladders that nobody had them, and they had a set that they kept just for picking their trees. The old Florida, they called it the Florida Common Orange, and it was what came from a seedling, and they were 40-foot trees. It was like oak trees. Had to be real gutsy to get a picking crew to go up there and pick it. So.
Could you tell us a little bit about your political career, how it started and what motivated you?
How it started? Oh, well. Dad was always, he never was in politics. One time I know somebody tried to get him to run for mayor, but he didn't. Small community, everybody was involved in the community. I mean, everybody worked hard and volunteered hard, and that's the only way you make things grow. Dad never got into politics. He was always, on the fringes of it. They tell the story about when there was a county commissioner that they were trying to get rid of, and they decided they would get a write-in candidate. And so Dad was part of a group that got together on Merritt Island where they had the meeting where they were deciding what to do, and the seated commissioner had the sheriff go up and write everybody's tag numbers down so he could see who was going to be running against them and how they were going to run against him. But anyway, it was small town politics in those days. We always had the 5 county commissioners. Dad's actually his real energy went toward, he was one of the founding directors of Wuesthoff Hospital. We never had a hospital. And this is in 1941. Mr. Wuesthoff, who was a winter resident from Wisconsin, the family had donated, because we didn't have a hospital here, they donated $12,500 if the city would raise the other $12,500. And Dad was very instrumental in that. And they did start Wuesthoff Hospital, a 10-bed hospital with $25,000. Rockledge gave them the land, and that was the beginning of Wuesthoff Hospital. And Dad served on that from 41 when they opened until he died in 76. And then I took his seat. I was elected to take his seat I was on the board for 30 years at Wuesthoff, and we saw it grow to a 270-bed community hospital. They later decided to, I was off the board, but they later decided they had to join a larger group, and it was not a community, what I consider a community hospital anymore. It was a big for-profit chain that bought it and still own it, which was kind of sad because the community, every room had somebody's name on it that had donated the money for it, and it was really a community effort as the hospital grew, to keep it going. Had some fine doctors that came here too because of that.
Could you tell us about your how about your serving as the port commissioner?
Oh, that's politics, yeah. Well, that was something I always, the port was actually something that was worked on from before the Second World War. They were trying to get a port there. And then the war came along and everything was on hold. So after the war, the late 40s, there was a couple of county commissioners decided that it would really be a good place for a port. It was never a port there. It was always a kind of a protected area. In fact, there used to be a little two-story hotel, stucco hotel up there. And there were two sisters, the Miss Whidden sisters, used to
What
keep
was the name?
Whidden.
Whitten?
Yeah, and they would keep me and my sister if the folks would go out of town, and it was great fun because there was a pier there, and shrimping was always a big industry. Commercial shipping was always shrimping was always a big industry, and but the shrimpers all had small boats in those days, and the pier went out. And they'd unload the shrimp at the end, but if it was a rough day, they had a way of hoisting the boat up out of the water so they could get the shrimp off of it instead of it rocking around. And it was great fun when we were kids to go up there because you got to eat in the kitchen and play on the beach all day. But the beach, there was hardly any beach. It was dunes. In fact, when a storm had come along, they just pull the boats up and put them in the dunes. To keep them the shrimp boats, and but where the cape goes out, the currents would come around the cape and sweep around that curve if you look at it on an aerial map, and the beach was soft sand until you got to the water's edge, and then you go out 6 or 8 feet and it would drop off because it was just cut that sand out and deposit it down in Cocoa Beach where we would drive on the sand. I mean, it was like Daytona Beach. And I hate to say this, but when the port was put in and the jetties were put out, it interrupted that flow. And that's why you don't see Cocoa Beach, this wide, hard sand anymore. But you see if you go into Jetty Park and go down into Canaveral, good hard beach again, because that comes around the jetties and is deposited right back in there, even though there is a sand trap out there because it would come back in and get in the channel. So there's a sand trap out there that does get emptied every so many years, and that sand is deposited further down. So there is a replenishment for the beaches further south now, but it's just not as like it used to be 60 years ago or 70 years ago. But anyway, watch that port grow. It was always interesting. I always had a friend who was there are 5 districts. When they tried to sell the port to the county, there were some mayors and county commissioners that went to the public and said, we want to put a port in. We think it's going to be good for the area. It's going to be good for the commercial fishing industry. And the thing is, we're going to have to tax you. We're going to have to collect taxes to get this port put in. And I don't remember the amount that they needed to raise, but Melbourne, about Pineda Causeway is the end of the port district because Melbourne said that's too far away. It'll never do us any good. And so the first commission, the commissioners were the mayors of Titusville, Cocoa, Rockledge, and 2 county commissioners, I think it was. And there wasn't a mayor in Cocoa Beach. And the guy in Titusville, they say, hardly ever came to the meetings because it was just too far to come to the meeting. he couldn't drive that far. So, anyway, it was something we watched. Tropicana had a plant there, and I can remember we would deliver fruit there. And Mr. Rossi was the one who started Tropicana. And of course, it's come a long way since then, but I can remember Dad sending me over there waiting on checks to be issued. And so anyway, it was always something I watched and admired and watched different friends of mine being commissioners, and finally got to a point that I had the time to do some other things, and the opportunity came along to run, so I did. That's when I ran for port and served a term. It was special interest group that decided they had somebody else they'd rather put in. So I only served one term, but I didn't know anybody anything.
Did you know Noah Butt growing up? And he
Yeah.
was really one of the instrumental in
Yeah.
that too, right? Pretty involved.
Yeah,
in
he
that.
was. Dave Nesbitt was another one. In fact, Dave Nesbitt was the county commissioner they were trying to write in. The meeting was over at Bobby Hill's house up at Indianola, which was his brother. So anyway, it was. Yeah, Dave was very instrumental in it. He was one of the commissioners, and he was one of the first. He was one of the county commissioners and one of the first commissioners on the port too. So, and now, of course, the port it hasn't been on the tax rolls since, I don't know, something like 20 years or more, because they're generating their own revenue.
Could you tell us about your other local involvements, such as the Rotary Club?
Yeah, the Rotary Club, I joined that in 1961. I came back from the Army after college. Of course, in those days, everybody had to go in the military of some sort to have the draft. And after I came back from the Army, the Rotary Club was formed by having one person from each industry. So you couldn't have two citrus growers in there, but you could have a citrus packer and a citrus grower and a citrus caretaker. You know, you had different categories. And so I first went in, that's all changed, of course. When I first went in, I was additional active to my father, who had been in the Rotary Club probably since he came here in the 30s. So, yeah, I've been in since 1961. So, again, I'm senior there too. But it's a good club, very active still. We now have female members, and actually, I was president, I don't know, back in sometime in the 70s, I was president, and they were just getting away from that category of having one from each category. And I'll never forget, because you went off for training as to how to be president, and one of the questions was about, it was getting to be a problem making the clubs grow. So the example was that at this one Rotary Club, the Cadillac dealer was holding down the new car sales category, and he was old and didn't really do much anymore. And the Volkswagen dealer came into town, and he was young and in the Chamber of Commerce and energetic and pushing the area. Not in Cocoa now. This was someplace else. And so they finally decided that they'd have a new big car dealer and a new little car dealer, and that's how they got around having new car dealers. And so, and then from then on, it got a lot easier to get in. But if you were the only lawyer, you could keep the other lawyers out if you wanted to in those days.
So tell us a little bit about when women came into the Rotary
Oh,
Club.
that really
Some
that
stories
changed
there.
things around. And as you and I both know, Kathy Schweinsberg in those days, yeah, when she was head of the library system for the county, she was the one of the first females that came in. And we had a friend of mine who was a fast food dealer or franchise holder, I won't say his name here in town, and he just knew it was going to ruin the club. If start bringing women in, it's just going to be terrible. And he made it known that he wasn't too happy about that. And Kathy just came in and said, well, if you want to worry about us, we're going to be the new pit bulls in the club. And so several years later, Kathy was inducted as the president of the club. And we're having the induction, the installation dinner out at the country club. And Kathy came in, and Kathy's an attractive woman. You all know her. She had a flowing red dress on, and I don't know, taffeta or whatever it is that these women wear, you know, and a big red scarf around her neck. And so they swore her in as president, and she tore the the scarf off her neck, and she had a collar on with spikes, you know, those dog collars that have spikes. He said, the pit bulls have taken over, she said. My friend had to swallow a few things. She was great.
Could you give us the name of your wife and your children for the record, please?
Yeah, Jeanette is my wife. She came down from Memphis, from Paris, Tennessee. In fact, we just got back. I tell my friends we were going to Paris, and then I have to tell them it's Tennessee. But it's a small town, Tennessee. We just came back from a family reunion up there about a week ago. But she came down because of the space industry. These young families were all coming in, young engineers. They all had kids. They were building schools faster than gas stations around here, and so they were recruiting teachers. And she just graduated from, it's Memphis State in those days. I think it's Memphis University now, as a teacher. And she tells a funny story. There were two of them. She and a friend of hers, they both were recruited here and hired as teachers. She was at Tropical Elementary on Merritt Island. She was hired for, not the first year, it was the second year they were open. And so they were coming down US 1, there weren't any interstates. And they got up there at Oak Hill where State Road 3 goes off, and it says Merritt Island. And so they said, well, that's where we're going. So they went down State Road 3. There's nothing, of course, there was nothing there except orange groves until they got to where the VAB building is now. And all this construction was going on. And they thought that was kind of interesting, and they kept coming. And keep in mind, they're from a small town. It's got the courthouse in the middle of the square. Everybody knows where the school is, and everybody knows where downtown is. Well, they get down to Merritt Island, and they couldn't find the town. So they went to Cocoa Beach and turned around and went to Cocoa. She said they went back and forth a couple of times. Finally, they stopped and asked them, they said, where's the town? Where's Merritt Island? And the guy looked at him and says, well, J.M. Fields just built a store up there. It's where Home Depot is now. They said, that might be downtown. So they were kind of confused. They said, well, where's the school? Well, I don't know. They built one over there, and I think there's another one going up over there. You know, they didn't know where anything was. So it was quite a cultural shock for them to come to this booming area. But it was booming, and it was a lot of fun. I mean, it was a good time to be young here. A lot of things going on at the beach. They were just picking astronauts, and the astronauts were everywhere, and you'd see them in stores and restaurants, and in their Corvettes going up and down the beach. And there were a lot of parties, and you know, they used to say, you see a bunch of cars, you just stop because there'd be a party going on, and you just join in. So where Pumpkin Center was, or it just burned down, it was the Wuesthoff house. Really, it was a log cabin. It was a winter place for the Wuesthoff family, and but they had leased it out. They rented it out. In those days, housing was a real, it was scarce, and so they had rented that. And there were always a couple of engineers there from Georgia Tech or someplace that were not married. They were here on trying to learn they were here for in between. They take a semester here, working for an Air Force or aerospace company. And so there was always a party there every Sunday. And we used to call it the new teacher. Every Labor Day weekend, they have the new school teacher party, because there were always new school teachers coming. But that is where I met Jeanette first time, at the new school teacher party there at Pelican Dunes is what it was known in those days. Cocoa Beach was booming. We got married in '66, 2 years later. We had 3 children. We lost our youngest child, but our middle child is Mary Pat Altman, who is married to Thad Altman, our state senator now, who, plug for him, he's going to run for the House because he's termed out at the Senate. She teaches at St. Mary's, and our oldest daughter is in Raleigh, North Carolina, and she actually teaches school also. And she had 3 boys. Mary Pat has a girl and 2 boys. So we've got family here. We've got 6 grandchildren. We've got a grandchild living with us right now. He's an intern working at an accounting firm in Orlando and about to enter UCF as a graduate student and still working there too. And Mary Pat has one at Auburn. She has one just starting at Ole Miss and one still in school at Holy Trinity. So they're all growing up. Yeah, I asked her middle child is called Hunter. I said they should have named him doctor or lawyer because he wants to be in the woods all the time hunting. I said, why'd you go to Ole Miss? He said, Pa, they call me Pa. Don't you know that's on the Mississippi Southern Flyway for the ducks? I said, oh, no, I didn't know that. But he's a good kid. I have a follow-up to that. I have a friend who's both husband and wife are doctors. And it was a while before I met their child. They have a son. He came in, and his name's Hunter. And I said, Aaron, what are you doing with a Hunter? I said, told him about my grandson. I said, you should have named him doctor or lawyer. He said, no, should have named him electrician or plumber. It's coming from a doctor.
What do you think is the defining trait of Cocoa? What do you think that sets it apart from any other city?
Still the small attitude of Cocoa Village. You know, even though we've grown tremendously around it, it's still got a small town feel to it. You've got, you can we used to have to go to Orlando to go shopping because there just wasn't anything much here to shop from. Even though we had a men's store and a women's store, but if you really wanted to go to the big town, you went to Orlando. But now you can, we've got Macy's, we've got all the big names here too. But Cocoa Village is still the village. And I think it's all around the Playhouse. So the city of Cocoa salvaged that. Somebody was trying to tear it down and put an office building up. And I don't know really how it happened, but the city ended up with the Playhouse and were able to preserve it, turn it over to the college to bring back, and I was privileged to be on the first board there and bringing it up to the first time we remodeled it, and I said the best day's work we did was hiring Stacy that's running the show now, and she's done a great job. So it's grown, and that was, I think, the nucleus for everything else that's happened downtown. Plus, city officials had enough sense. There was a Colonel Frank Zamboni was his name, and at the same time he put a little store. He was retired military, came to downtown Cocoa, put a little store up, a little general store, and that and the Playhouse all happened about the same time. Then they started putting in the pavers and the trees, and that's what turned Cocoa Village around to what it is today. So it's really a great place to live. I'm not looking to move.
Anything else you would like to mention or talk about that you think is interesting?
Think of anything you wanted to mention, or you think we would find interesting, or?
Well, the growth is really the big change that I've seen. I mean, we used to go, of course, City of Cocoa's water came from Clear Lake, where the college is now. And to get there, you'd have to go down to Peachtree Street and go up Clear Lake Road now, but you just, the old water plant, I don't know, it's about halfway up. And from there to Clear Lake was all dirt road and dirt ruts. And that's what we do on a Saturday if we weren't going to the movie, because it'd take all day. You'd pack a lunch and we'd go out and swim in Clear Lake, even though it was a water supply for Cocoa. But it was where the planetarium is now. There was a big hill there, and you could ride your bike down that hill into the into the lake, crazy things like that. But it was a day trip just to go to Clear Lake. You can get there in 5 minutes now. So, the big changes like that, and you knew everybody knew you. I mean, you better behave yourself, because if you didn't, everybody knew you were in the doghouse. That's the big change. The big change was It was a small community where everybody knew each other. It's still a small community, but everybody doesn't know each other anymore. You could talk on forever about the changes. Everybody walks around with a little telephone in their pocket now because of what we did when we were always out, away from telephones. And when the first contractor started out here with NASA, AT&T put a mobile telephone line in. It was a single line, and these were for your car. And the box in your trunk was like this, and a big aerial on the roof. And my father had one. I think it was 57 or 58. I'm trying to remember which car it was. It was 57, 58. He had a phone in his car, and it was a open line. I mean, sometimes it was better than listening to your radio because of these contractors that were going. There was one contractor. He, even though you could turn the volume on because if you were out of your car, you could hear it. Well, it'd blow the horn if you needed, if the phone rang, but you could ride down the road and listen to everybody. And he had a superintendent, this guy, and he'd send the superintendent out of town to do something. And the next thing he'd do is call the guy's wife. And it was all on this open line, so there was a lot going on the single phone line, and but it was kind of neat. But that's a big change. I mean, when you look at the first car phone that I was aware of, and what we've got now, it's just unbelievable, the changes. I think when I got out of college, I think there were 6 million people in the whole state. And we're pushing 20-something million, 22 million now. So, it's a big change. Everything that didn't have a house on it was in Orange Grove, just about. And all up and down both coasts.
West of 95, where Vieira is today, was.
Oh, it was Duda's cattle ranch. My cousin John Dalbor, who's 91 now and retired, lives down in at a retirement community. He says he lives in a cow pasture with a bunch of old people because that's what it was. But yeah, that kind of change is you can't stop it, but and you don't want to stop it, but it would just like it controlled a little bit. The barge canal, that's a story. A lot of people think it's called the barge canal because you can bring a barge through it. No, it's really called the barge canal because when they cut it through, the only road going up the island was Tropical Trail. And when they cut it, they had to put some way, they didn't have a bridge built yet. So they put a barge in. So you went down a ramp, across the barge, and up a ramp on the other side. And the school buses would come across, the kids would have to walk across because it was dangerous. Our fruit trucks would have to go to Titusville because you couldn't bring it across and bring it around until they got a bridge in. So, things like that. The building of the port, when it was first built, of course, it was all dredged out. It wasn't natural. And there's a guy in my class, Roger Fowler, and he lived on Merritt Island, and he had a buddy whose father was running the dredge. And so they were about to break through to the ocean. And Roger and his buddy wanted to go out there and ride the dredge. And his father told him, he said, go on and go to school. He said, we're not going to get there before you get out of school. So he got out of school and went right up to the port, and he'd already broken through because he got soft sand and he was making time. And he said, so we went on out on the barge, out to the dredge. I said, well, Roger, how'd you get out there? He said, well, we just walked along the pipe, where they were piping the sand out. So you couldn't do that today. So, there were things like that got done just because you did it and you could do it. And today, I don't know, you can't do, you were too restricted now. The fish in the river was great. Mullet, you leave your boat in the water overnight, you'd have 10 or 12 dead mullet in the bottom of the boat the next morning because they would jump. They were that plentiful. Used to have the mullet fishermen would have flat bottom boats because they would come into the shallows here, and they put this big net out, and and then draw it in, and they draw, as they brought this big seine net in, you bring in the fish. Of course, they're illegal now, but you could buy, they'd be out here and you'd buy the mullet from them for $0.25 apiece. They take the heads off.
You fry it up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Talk about fresh.
Yeah. We're trying to preserve some of that at the Field Manor. I know you know something about that, Michael. This is a piece of property up on North Merritt Island before the Barge Canal on the old Tropical Trail. And the Field family came down after the Civil War also. And it's quite a story. I had to interview the last Field that was living here about the family, because we gave them an award at Farm Bureau. I'm a member of the Brevard County Farm Bureau, and we give these awards for the farm family and the farm individual every year. But we realized that a lot of the people that came to this area that made the industry that we're taking advantage of now weren't around when we were giving awards out. So we have a posthumous award. And so I got to interview and learn something about the Fields. And they came down after the Civil War from Georgia in a covered wagon. They came into Titusville and went across and settled in this property that's there now. And it was a family. They had 3 or 4 children. And they had, in those days, they were giving out land grants. Well, you had to grow to keep the land grant. And it was 160 acres was each land grant. And at one time, when the family expanded, they owned property from the Indian River all the way to Sykes Creek. And they had to grow something within 3 years. So they had to live off the land, but they started growing sugar cane was one of the things that they grew, because that grew in a hurry. But anyway, the family prospered and built a house in the late 1800s, which is there now. And the last Field that passed away put everything, there's about 40 some acres that's left in the main part of property. And she wanted it kept for the community to be able to see how the settlers settled and how they lived. And the original house is there with a lot of the original furnishings. And there's a trustee that's taking care of that, and there's a board that's working it. And they're trying to make that something for the community. They are making it something for the community, a lot of functions. And in fact, we're going to have a fish fry, because that was one of the things they did for the community back then. And then they gather, they'd just get fish and oysters out of the river, and that's what they would eat. So we're going to have fish fry and oyster roast in November. So hopefully we'll get a crowd to come out and see how those things used to be. Of course, there'll be a tent there now. They didn't have a tent, but they did live in that covered wagon and in a tent. And finally, the original Fields, the senior Fields, went back. They had lost a child here because of the hard living, and one of their children was married, so he stayed, and he was the Field family that grew here. They stayed, and everybody else went back to Georgia.
Were they related to the Fields that had the store on Merritt Island that you mentioned earlier, the J.M. Field store? Was that
No.
the same family?
J.M.
Okay.
Fields was it was a chain store.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the first chain store we had.
Okay.
Somebody's bought them out now. They're not around, but that was our department store.
Okay.
Yeah. No, they actually he ran Travis Hardware. The last Fields did. Plus they had groves too. So I can't.
All right, well, thank you for talking with us.
Okay. I hope I told you something that was of interest and didn't ramble on too much.
Yeah, it was very interesting, and we're thankful that you could participate in this interview.
Well, I like to talk about the area, so I hope I don't bore anybody.
Thank you, Frank.
Okay.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Well,
That was great.
okay.